On July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille in Paris. The event would become one of the most famous moments in modern history. Every year, France still commemorates it as a national holiday. Yet there is something strange about that. The Bastille was not the seat of government. It did not command armies. It did not govern the kingdom. It held only a small number of prisoners. So why did the fall of this fortress become one of the most important political events in history? The answer lies not in what the Bastille was, but in what it represented. The storming of the Bastille revealed a deeper transformation already taking place within French society. To understand why this event mattered, we must understand the relationship between power and distance. For centuries, power did not need to be defended because it could not easily be reached. Kings did not simply rule, they stood apart. Their authority was sustained not only through institutions, but through hierarchy, ritual, privilege, and controlled access. To obey power was one thing. To approach it was another entirely. Distance was not an accident of political organization. It was one of its foundations. When power remains distant, it appears stable. It feels inevitable. It rarely needs to justify itself because it is protected from continuous challenge. The greater the separation between those who rule and those who obey, the more authority can present itself as something fixed, something that exists above negotiation. A distant authority becomes difficult to question not only because it is protected, but because it appears woven into the structure of the world itself. But distance does not last forever. It can narrow gradually through pressure, expectation, and change. And when it narrows enough, something begins to shift. Authority that once appeared untouchable becomes visible in a different way. Not as an abstract force, but as something that occupies space, something that can be approached, and once power can be approached, it can be tested. This is why the Bastille mattered. What happens when a political system built upon distance begins to lose it? That question took physical form when a crowd moved toward a fortress that represented royal authority within the city itself. What followed was more than an act of violence. It was a confrontation between power and proximity, and its consequences would extend far beyond the walls of the Bastille. To understand why the Bastille became so important, we first need to understand the world around it. Late 18th century France was not governed by power in one simple, visible form. Authority was distributed through institutions, privileges, and social divisions. It reached ordinary people, but rarely exposed itself directly to them. What held this system together was not only law or coercion, but separation, between ruler and subject, between center and periphery, between those who governed and those who were governed. This structure is often described as the Ancien Régime. At its center stood the monarchy. But even the king was not continuously visible. Royal authority was projected outward through symbols, ceremonies, and institutions that preserved its elevation. The court at Versailles functioned not only as a seat of power, but as a space of controlled access. To approach the king required permission, status, and proximity to the structures that surrounded him. Power was not absent. It was deliberately kept beyond reach. Throughout the kingdom, nobility, clergy, and administrative offices stood between the monarchy and the population. These groups did not merely assist the monarchy, they filtered it. They translated royal authority into local realities while preserving the separation that made it appear stable and legitimate. For most of the population, power was not something encountered directly. It was experienced through obligations, taxes, laws, and restrictions. Authority existed as a condition of life not as a presence to be confronted. Because power remained distant, it could appear inevitable. Its decisions arrived from above through institutions that did not invite direct negotiation. In this environment, obedience did not always feel imposed. It often felt natural. But distance also created fragility. A system that depends on separation must continuously maintain it. It must ensure that access remains limited, that authority is not exposed to direct pressure, and that its symbols retain their credibility. Once these conditions begin to weaken, authority does not immediately disappear, but it begins to lose its insulation. By the late 18th century, that protection was beginning to fail. War, debt, and inefficient taxation created a situation in which the monarchy required more resources than its existing system could easily provide. At the same time, the distribution of burden remained unequal. Large segments of the population carried responsibilities without corresponding influence. This imbalance was not new. What was changing was the awareness of it. Intellectual currents associated with the Enlightenment circulated new ways of thinking about authority, rights, and legitimacy. These ideas did not immediately dismantle the existing system, but they altered how it was perceived. Authority was no longer accepted solely because it existed. It began to be evaluated. Once people began to question the structure, distance alone was no longer sufficient to sustain it. In 1789, the monarchy took a step that would unintentionally narrow the distance it depended on. It convened the Estates General, an assembly representing the three traditional estates of French society: clergy, nobility, and commoners. The purpose was practical, to address the financial crisis, but the effect was structural. For the first time in generations, representatives from across the kingdom were brought into a single political space to deliberate on matters of authority. Expectations emerged. Grievances were articulated. The idea that power could be discussed and perhaps influenced began to take shape. This did not immediately dismantle the system, but it altered its dynamics. Distance, once taken for granted, was now being negotiated. In Paris, these shifts were felt not as abstract developments, but as tension. Rumors circulated, uncertainty grew. The presence of royal troops near the city intensified the sense that something was about to change, though no one could yet define exactly what. What mattered was not a single decision, but a cumulative effect. The structures that had long kept authority at a distance were beginning to loosen. The system did not collapse all at once. It narrowed, step by step, until the boundary that once seemed fixed became something that could be crossed. By the summer of 1789, Paris no longer felt stable. Not yet revolutionary in a defined sense, but no longer stable. Authority had not collapsed, yet it no longer felt secure. What replaced stability was not clarity. It was tension. This tension did not originate from a single event. It accumulated. In the weeks following the convening of the Estates General, political expectations began to rise. Debates over representation and authority moved beyond the assembly. News traveled into the city. Discussions multiplied. What had once been contained within institutions was now entering public space. At the same time, economic pressure intensified the atmosphere. Bread prices rose. Supplies tightened. Daily life became more uncertain. These conditions did not create coordination, but they shaped how events were perceived. Hardship sharpened attention and made every rumor more believable. Rumors began to shape reality. Information was incomplete, often unreliable, and rapidly transmitted. Reports of troop movements near Paris circulated widely. Royal forces appeared to be positioning themselves around the city. Whether these movements were precaution or preparation remained unclear. What mattered was how they were understood, and they were understood as a threat. In this environment, perception moved faster than verification. Each new report reinforced the same possibility. Authority might act against the city. Distance might be restored by force. The sense of waiting became a form of pressure in itself. Anticipation turned into a shared state of tension. On July 11th, the dismissal of Jacques Necker intensified these fears. Necker was widely seen as sympathetic to reform. His removal suggested a shift away from negotiation and toward control. For many in Paris, this confirmed what they had already begun to fear. Authority might no longer be distant, but it could still act. The following days saw a rapid escalation. Crowds gathered, not as a single organized force, but as converging groups responding to shared uncertainty. The question was no longer abstract. If authority could act, then the population would need to respond. Hesitation became harder to sustain, and inaction began to feel like risk. But response required means. On July 13th and 14th, attention turned toward arms. The Hôtel des Invalides was seized. Thousands of muskets were taken. Now the population was armed. The situation had changed. Yet weapons alone were not sufficient. Gunpowder was still needed. The target became clear. The Bastille. The Bastille was not heavily defended. It held few prisoners. It did not control the city, but it contained gunpowder. More importantly, it carried meaning. It represented the capacity of the monarchy to act without transparency, to imprison without process, to exercise authority beyond immediate scrutiny. It stood as a visible reminder that power, even when distant, could intervene. On the morning of July 14th, a crowd moved toward the fortress. At first, the movement was not purely confrontational. There were attempts at negotiation. Representatives approached the governor, Bernard-René de Launay, seeking access to the gunpowder. The objective was practical. The situation was not. Time passed. Tension increased. Misunderstandings and mistrust shaped the interaction. Armed individuals gathered. Authority was unclear on both sides. Control became fragile. No single decision triggered what followed. The pressure had already been building, and the threshold was near. Each passing moment made reversal less likely. Then the situation broke. Violence began. Gunfire was exchanged. What had begun as an attempt to secure resources became a confrontation. The crowd did not withdraw. It advanced. The fortress was designed to resist armies. It was not designed to absorb sustained pressure from a population that no longer accepted distance. As the hours passed, the balance shifted. Defenders struggled to maintain control. The crowd grew in number and persistence. Reinforcements arrived, not as an organized army, but as participants drawn into the event. Each arrival made retreat less likely and commitment more complete. Momentum replaced hesitation. By the afternoon, the situation became untenable. Governor de Launay ordered a ceasefire. He agreed to surrender. The gates were opened. The Bastille fell. The final moments were brief. The meaning was not. A structure that had stood for generations as a symbol of royal authority had been taken by force. Not by a rival state, not by a formal army, but by a population acting within a space that authority had once kept at a distance. This was not yet the collapse of the monarchy, but something irreversible had occurred. The boundary between authority and population had been crossed, not in theory, in practice. And once that boundary is crossed, it cannot be restored to what it was. The fall of the Bastille did not destroy the monarchy. but it changed the conditions under which authority could exist. What had once been maintained through distance could no longer rely on it. The separation that had protected power from direct pressure had been breached. Authority was no longer experienced as something above society. It was now something that could be approached, tested, and confronted. This shift did not create a new system, but it could not be reversed. Before July 14th, authority operated with insulation. Its decisions arrived through structures that filtered contact and reduced exposure. After the Bastille, that insulation was weakened. Power had been encountered directly, and that experience could not be undone. Something had been demonstrated. What had once seemed fixed revealed itself as conditional. The perception of inevitability weakened, and with it, the quiet acceptance that had sustained the system. That demonstration changed how power functioned. A system built on distance must preserve the conditions that make distance credible. Once those conditions break, authority must adapt. It can no longer rely on separation alone. It must justify itself in ways that can withstand contact. This pressure became visible almost immediately. Political space expanded, discussion intensified. Claims that had once remained unspoken began to circulate openly. Questions that had once remained contained within institutions now entered public life. It did not produce coherence, it produced instability. Because once distance collapses, the relationship between power and society must be renegotiated. Authority is no longer simply recognized. It must be explained, defended, and asserted under new conditions. A new problem emerged. If authority remains distant, it risks irrelevance. If it becomes too accessible, it risks losing control. The balance that had once stabilized the system could no longer be restored in its original form. The monarchy now faced this problem directly. It could not return to the previous model of separation. The Bastille had shown that physical proximity no longer protected authority, but no fully developed alternative had yet emerged to replace the old one. This gap between expectation and structure became a source of tension. Authority still existed. Its meaning did not. At the same time, the symbolic dimension of power had changed. The Bastille had functioned as a visible expression of royal authority within the city. Its fall did not remove the monarchy, but it removed one of the ways in which authority made itself present. More importantly, it showed that symbols could be challenged and overturned. What had once reinforced authority could now expose it. The more power appeared within reach, the more it invited pressure. The direction of perception had reversed. Power no longer defined how society understood itself. Society began to define how power would be understood. This reversal carried long-term consequences. Once authority becomes subject to continuous evaluation, stability depends less on distance and more on legitimacy. Power must justify itself in terms that can be recognized and accepted. It must respond to expectations that are no longer contained by strict separation. This does not make authority weaker in a simple sense. It makes it more exposed. Exposure changes how power behaves. It requires new forms of organization, new languages of legitimacy, and new ways of managing conflict between control and participation. It demands constant adjustment. It removes the possibility of governing from a protected distance. The Bastille did not resolve these tensions. It revealed them. And once revealed, they could not be contained again. The structure of authority had not yet been replaced, but it had already begun to change, and it would not return to what it had been. What happened at the Bastille reveals a distinction that is often overlooked: the difference between authority and legitimacy. Authority is the ability to command. Legitimacy is the reason that command is accepted without constant force. Before July 14th, the French monarchy possessed both. It could command, and it operated within a structure that made its commands appear natural. Distance played a central role in this balance. It limited exposure, reduced friction, and allowed authority to exist without being continuously questioned. The Bastille disrupted that balance. Authority remained, but legitimacy began to shift. Legitimacy does not depend only on what power can do, it depends on how power is experienced. When authority is distant, it appears stable. Its actions are filtered through institutions that absorb tension and reduce confrontation. People do not encounter power itself, they encounter its effects. That distance allows legitimacy to persist, even when inequality exists. But when distance collapses, perception changes. Power no longer stands above society, it stands within it. What once appeared inevitable now appears conditional. That change cannot be reversed. And once power is experienced directly, it must justify itself continuously. Legitimacy becomes active. It must be produced. This changes how authority functions. It can no longer rely on inherited structures alone. It must generate reasons that can be recognized in the present and respond to expectations that are no longer contained by separation. Authority becomes more immediate, but also more vulnerable to scrutiny. This exposure creates pressure. When legitimacy weakens, authority compensates. Force increases. Surveillance expands. Responses become faster and less tolerant of uncertainty. Power becomes more visible, more direct, and more reactive. This can create the appearance of strength, but it is a different kind of strength. A system that relies on pressure must sustain that pressure. It cannot afford hesitation. It cannot absorb doubt without interpreting it as risk. Over time, it becomes less flexible and more dependent on constant control. This pattern extends beyond this event. A system built on distance can appear stable for long periods. But once that distance is broken, stability depends on a different mechanism. It depends on legitimacy under exposure. This is more demanding. Authority must align its actions with expectations that are now visible and contested. It must operate in a space where every decision is interpreted and evaluated. Distance could once absorb inconsistency. Exposure cannot. This is the deeper implication of the Bastille. It did not simply weaken royal authority, it changed the way authority had to function. Power could no longer remain partially hidden. Visibility now carried consequences. Every action became meaningful. Every decision carried weight. Every inconsistency became a source of tension. Power must now manage perception continuously. Nor was this a temporary condition. Once a population has experienced authority as something that can be confronted, it does not return easily to passive acceptance. The expectation of engagement remains, and with it, the expectation that authority must explain itself. The Bastille, therefore, marks more than a political rupture. It marks a change in how power sustains itself. From that point forward, authority in France could no longer assume legitimacy as a consequence of separation. It had to operate within a space where it could be seen, questioned, and judged. Legitimacy could no longer be assumed. It had to be produced. And once legitimacy depends on that kind of exposure, it cannot be preserved by structure alone. It survives only as long as it can be continually justified. The storming of the Bastille did not resolve the tensions it revealed. It exposed them. The structures that had once sustained authority through distance could no longer function in the same way. What had been broken was not only a fortress, but a relationship between power and society that had depended on separation. That relationship could not be restored. In the years that followed, France did not simply replace one form of authority with another. It moved through a period of uncertainty in which power was repeatedly redefined, challenged, and reorganized. The problem was no longer how to preserve distance, but how to govern without it. This was a more difficult problem. Distance simplifies authority. It allows power to exist without constant explanation and reduces friction by limiting contact. But once that separation disappears, the expectations placed upon authority change as well. Stability no longer depends on distance, but on the ability to sustain legitimacy under constant observation. This was not limited to 1789. It describes a broader transformation in how power functions. Once people experience authority as something that can be approached and confronted, that expectation does not disappear. It becomes part of political life. Power is no longer something to be endured. It becomes something to be questioned, interpreted, and judged. This is why the Bastille became far more than the fall of a prison. It marked the moment that expectation became real. Not fully defined and not yet institutionalized, but unavoidable. From that point forward, authority in France could no longer depend on distance to sustain belief. It had to operate within a space where it could be seen, examined, and contested. And once power exists in that space, it cannot return to what it was before. It must adapt. Because once authority can no longer rely on distance, legitimacy becomes its most important foundation.